The forgotten sister who negotiated peace in the shadows. The rain falls softly against the windows of the U.S. ambassador's residence in Dublin, each droplet catching the amber glow of the desk lamp before sliding down the glass in quiet rivulets that blur the nighttime city beyond. It is 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in March 1995, and Jean Kennedy Smith sits alone at her desk, the only person awake in this grand building that serves as both home and diplomatic fortress. She is 66 years old, the last surviving Kennedy sister, the quietest one, the one most people forgot existed even when her brothers were defining American politics. Before her on the polished mahogany surface lies a draft agreement, pages of carefully negotiated language that could, if handled correctly, contribute to ending decades of violence in Northern Ireland. Her reading glasses sit low on her nose. Her hands, elegant but marked by age, rest on either side of the document, as though steadying something that might otherwise float away. Outside, Dublin sleeps. Inside, Jean carries the weight of history in a way that no one will ever fully see or understand. This is not the glamorous diplomacy of state dinners and photo opportunities. This is the grinding, exhausting work of bringing together people who hate each other, of finding language that allows sworn enemies to sit in the same room, of building trust where there has been only suspicion and violence for generations. She picks up her pen, makes a small notation in the margin. Her handwriting is precise, controlled, revealing nothing of the tremor she feels inside. The fear that she is not enough for this task, that the Kennedy name she carries is both asset and impossible burden, that she will fail at the one thing she has been asked to do that truly matters. The document before her represents months of secret meetings, late-night phone calls, carefully worded messages passed through intermediaries. It represents conversations she has had with Irish politicians, with British diplomats, with representatives of groups that officially do not exist, with people who have lost loved ones to violence and who are being asked to somehow move beyond that loss toward peace. And it represents something more personal. It represents Jean's attempt to prove that she matters, that the quiet Kennedy sister who was always overlooked, always in the background, always dismissed as less important than her louder, more dramatic siblings, can actually change the world in ways they never did. Her brothers commanded armies and ran for president and were martyred in public squares. Jean sits in offices after midnight, negotiating the careful language of peace, and no one will ever write songs about her or build monuments to her work. But perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the quiet work, the unglamorous, patient, invisible labor of diplomacy is actually more important than the headlines and the photo opportunities. Perhaps Jean, dismissed her entire life as the forgettable sister, is doing exactly what needs to be done, precisely because she is willing to do it without glory, without recognition, without the applause that her siblings always required. The rain continues. The clock on the wall ticks quietly forward, and Jean Kennedy Smith bends once more over the document that might help end a conflict that has consumed Ireland for longer than she has been alive, carrying alone the weight of being Camelot's last diplomatic voice, the forgotten sister who negotiated peace in the shadows while the world looked elsewhere. To understand Jean Kennedy Smith, you must first understand what it meant to be the eighth child in a family of 9, arriving in 1928 into a household already crowded with siblings louder, more dramatic, more commanding of their father's attention. Joe Jr. was the golden heir. Jack was the intellectual charmer. Bobby was fierce and loyal. Eunice was driven and purposeful. Even the sisters who struggled, Rosemary with her disabilities, Kik with her rebellions, were at least notable for their struggles. But Jean was quiet, pleasant, easy to overlook, the daughter who caused no problems and thus received little attention. Joseph Kennedy Sr. barely noticed her. He was too focused on grooming his sons for power, on positioning Jack and Bobby for political futures, on building the dynasty that would make the Kennedy name synonymous with American leadership. Rose Kennedy, cold and emotionally distant with all her children, seemed particularly uninterested in Jean, who asked for nothing and thus received nothing. Jean learned early that survival in the Kennedy family meant finding a role that did not threaten anyone else's position. She could not be the brilliant son. That was Jack. She could not be the fierce enforcer. That was Bobby. She could not even be the troubled child who demanded intervention. That was Rosemary. So John became the accommodating one, the sister who agreed with everyone, who supported every family decision, who never complained or demanded or made her own needs visible. But beneath this accommodating exterior, John was watching. She was absorbing how power worked in her family, how her father manipulated people and situations, how her brothers learned to charm and command and control. She was learning even as a child that there were many forms of power, the loud, obvious power that her brothers wielded, but also the quiet power of understanding people, of listening more than speaking, of building relationships through patience rather than force. She attended the right schools, learned the social graces expected of Kennedy daughters, developed a presentation that was polished but never threatening. Unlike Kick, who rebelled and was exiled, Jean accepted the constraints placed on Kennedy daughters without visible struggle. She married appropriately Stephen Edward Smith, a businessman who could manage Kennedy family finances and political campaigns without competing for the spotlight. She had 4 children, maintained the social obligations, appeared at family gatherings and political events with a smile that revealed nothing of whatever she actually felt. Through all of this, Jean remained fundamentally invisible. When people cataloged the Kennedy siblings, they mentioned Joe Jr.'s death, Jack's presidency, Bobby's transformation into a voice for social justice, Eunice's work with Special Olympics, even Rosemary's tragedy, and Kick's romantic rebellion. But Jean was simply there, a name on the family tree, someone who existed but did not particularly matter to the larger Kennedy story. This invisibility wounded her in ways she rarely acknowledged even to herself. She had grown up believing that she did not matter, that her thoughts and feelings and capabilities were less important than those of her more dramatic siblings. She had internalized the family's judgment that she was forgettable, and this internalization shaped everything about how she moved through the world. Carefully, quietly, always ready to step aside, always believing that whatever she contributed was probably not very important. When Jack became president in 1961, Jean was 33 years old, married with young children, living a comfortable but unremarkable life in New York. She attended the inauguration, watched her brother take the oath of office, participated in the celebrations that marked the arrival of Camelot. But she was not part of the inner circle, not someone whose opinion Jack sought or whose counsel mattered to the administration. And then Dallas happened. November 22nd, 1963. Jean lost her brother in the most public, traumatic way imaginable. The grief was profound, not just for Jack, but for the entire myth of Camelot that had been constructed around his presidency. The beautiful young family, the promise of youth and vigor transforming American politics, the sense that the Kennedy name represented something special and transformative. All of it shattered in a single afternoon in Texas. 5 years later, Bobby was killed in Los Angeles, June 5th, 1968. Jean had now lost 2 brothers to assassination, had watched the Kennedy dynasty that her father had spent decades building get destroyed by violence. The grief compounded, became almost unbearable. But Jean, true to her nature, processed this grief privately, quietly, without the dramatic public mourning that characterized some of her siblings. What remained of the Kennedy political legacy fell increasingly to Ted, the youngest brother, who carried the weight badly. Chappaquiddick in 1969 permanently damaged his presidential prospects. The drinking, the scandals, the sense that Ted was crumbling under pressure that his older brothers had carried more gracefully. All of this meant that the Kennedy dynasty was fading, becoming more myth than reality, more memory than present force. For Jean, this created a strange position. She was one of the few Kennedy siblings not personally destroyed by tragedy or scandal. She had lived quietly, avoided the spotlight, maintained her marriage, and raised her children without public drama. She was, in the Kennedy context, remarkably stable and intact. But this stability was invisible precisely because it was stable. No one pays attention to the sister who simply continues, who does not fall apart, who quietly carries on without demanding recognition for her endurance. By the 1980s, Jean was in her 50s, her children grown, her husband managing Kennedy family financial and political interests. She devoted herself to charitable work, particularly the very special arts program she founded to provide arts opportunities for people with disabilities. Continuing Eunice's work in a different form, honoring Rosemary through action rather than words. But this work, meaningful as it was, felt somehow insufficient. Jean had spent her entire life being the accommodating Kennedy daughter, the one who supported everyone else's visions and ambitions. She had never quite developed her own, never quite claimed a space in the world that was distinctly hers. In 1993, something unexpected happened. Bill Clinton, newly elected president, needed to appoint a U.S. ambassador to Ireland. The position was sensitive. Northern Ireland was still mired in decades of sectarian violence known as the Troubles, and any American diplomatic presence in Ireland had to navigate carefully between supporting peace efforts and not appearing to take sides in an internal British conflict. Clinton wanted someone with name recognition, someone whose presence would signal American commitment to Irish peace, someone with political connections who could open doors, and he wanted someone with diplomatic skill, the ability to build relationships, to listen, to find common ground between people who hated each other. Someone offered Jean's name. She was a Kennedy, which provided the name recognition. She had decades of experience in charitable work that required building coalitions and bringing together diverse stakeholders. And she was quiet, non-threatening, someone who could work effectively without making everything about her own ego. When Jean was approached about the ambassadorship, her first response was doubt. She had no formal diplomatic experience. She had spent her life being told, implicitly and explicitly, that she was not as capable as her siblings. She carried decades of internalized belief that she did not matter, that anything she attempted would probably be inadequate. Why would she, the forgettable Kennedy sister, be the right person for this role? But there was also something else, a spark of possibility, of hope that perhaps finally, at age 65, she might have the chance to do something that was genuinely important, that might allow her to step out of her siblings' shadows and prove that she had capabilities of her own. The Senate confirmation hearings were perfunctory. She was a Kennedy, after all, and had strong political support. In June 1993, Jean Kennedy Smith became the U.S. ambassador to Ireland. The appointment was seen by many as largely ceremonial. Ireland was not a major diplomatic posting. The troubles in Northern Ireland were intractable, had resisted decades of peace efforts, were considered essentially unsolvable in the short term. Jean was expected to attend dinners, give speeches, maintain good relations with Irish politicians, and otherwise be a pleasant, relatively invisible American presence. No one expected her to actually change anything significant. No one, that is, understood who Jean actually was beneath the quiet exterior. They saw the accommodating Kennedy sister. They did not see the woman who had spent a lifetime watching, learning, understanding how power actually works, developing skills in listening and relationship building that her louder siblings had never needed because they always had the attention they demanded. Jean arrived in Dublin and immediately began working in ways that surprised the professional diplomats around her. She did not seek publicity or attention. She did not give grandstanding speeches about American leadership or Kennedy legacy. Instead, she began the quiet, patient work of building relationships with everyone involved in the Irish peace process. Irish government officials, British diplomats, Northern Irish politicians from both communities, and critically, representatives of Sinn Féin, the political wing of the Irish Republican Army. This last connection was controversial. The British government and many Irish politicians considered Sinn Féin beyond the pale, terrorists who should be isolated rather than engage. But Jean understood something that others missed. Peace would never come unless all parties, including those who had been engaged in violence, were brought into the conversation. You could not exclude major stakeholders and expect them to honor whatever agreement was reached without them. Jean began inviting Gerry Adams, the Sinn Féin leader, to events at the American Embassy. She advocated for granting him a visa to visit the United States, arguing that American involvement could help legitimize the peace process and provide cover for Sinn Féin to move away from violence toward political negotiation. The British government was furious. Many Irish politicians were skeptical. The State Department was concerned that Jean was overstepping her authority, but Jean persisted. She had spent her entire life being told she did not matter. that her judgment was not important. She had learned to doubt herself, to defer to others, to assume that smarter, more experienced people knew better than she did. But on this issue, she trusted her instincts. She believed that excluding Sinn Féin was a mistake, that bringing them into the diplomatic process was essential for any lasting peace. She worked behind the scenes, having quiet conversations, building trust with people on all sides of the conflict. She listened more than she spoke, a skill her louder siblings had never developed. She understood that people who have been marginalized and dismissed their entire lives, as she had been, often have insights that the powerful miss because they have never bothered to listen to voices they consider unimportant. Her approach was not dramatic or headline-grabbing. There were no grand speeches or photo opportunities that made the evening news. Jiang simply worked day after day, meeting with people, facilitating conversations, finding ways to build trust where there had been only suspicion. The professional diplomats around her were initially skeptical, then gradually impressed. Jean Kennedy Smith, the quiet Kennedy sister no one had ever particularly noticed, was proving to be remarkably effective at the patient, unglamorous work of diplomacy. In 1994, the Irish Republican Army declared a ceasefire. It was not a final peace. That would take years more of negotiation, but it was a critical breakthrough. Violence that had been constant for decades suddenly stopped. The ceasefire created space for serious political negotiations that had been impossible while bombs were still exploding and people were still dying. Jean's role in facilitating this breakthrough was significant but largely invisible. Her advocacy for engaging Sinn Féin, her work building relationships with all parties, her patient diplomacy that had convinced people to at least try talking instead of killing, all of this contributed to creating conditions where a ceasefire became possible. But because Jean had worked quietly, without seeking credit or publicity, many people did not realize her contribution. This was in some ways exactly how Jean preferred it. She had never sought glory. Unlike her brothers, who required public recognition and applause, Jean was content to work in the background, to contribute without needing her name attached to the accomplishment. The work itself was what mattered, not the recognition. But there was also cost to this invisibility. Jean's siblings, the dead ones martyred and mythologized, the living ones still seeking validation, received endless attention and analysis. Jean's actual, substantive contribution to Irish peace received a fraction of the notice. She was still, even in her diplomatic success, the forgotten Kennedy sister, the one whose accomplishments were considered less important than her brother's public dramas. The British government, which had opposed Jean's approach, grudgingly acknowledged that her engagement strategy had been correct. Irish politicians who had been skeptical admitted that she had helped create diplomatic breakthrough where they had seen only deadlock. But the public narrative remained focused on the political leaders and negotiators, on the men who signed agreements and gave speeches. Jean remained in the background, as she had always been, her work visible to those who understood diplomacy, but invisible to the general public. What the public did not see was the emotional toll this work took on Jean. Every meeting with victims of violence, every conversation with people who had lost family members to bombs and bullets, reopened her own wounds from losing Jack and Bobby. She understood grief in ways that allowed her to connect with people who had experienced loss through the Troubles. But this understanding also meant carrying additional weight, not just her diplomatic responsibilities, but the accumulated grief of decades. Jean's marriage to Stephen Smith had always been solid, but complicated by the demands of Kennedy family obligations. Stephen managed family finances and political interests, which meant his time and attention were constantly divided. During Jean's ambassadorship, the strain increased. She was in Dublin, he was often in New York, and the separation took its toll on a relationship that had already required enormous patience and compromise. Her children, now adults with their own lives, were proud of their mother, but also somewhat bewildered by this late career transformation. Jean had been the accommodating mother, the one who had supported their activities and ambitions without demanding much attention for herself. Now suddenly she was the U.S. ambassador to Ireland, working on peace negotiations that carried historical significance. It required them to recalibrate their understanding of who their mother actually was beneath the quiet exterior. Jean also struggled with imposter syndrome. The persistent feeling that she was not adequate for this role, that she had been given the position because of her name rather than her capabilities, that at any moment people would realize she was not actually qualified and the entire enterprise would collapse. This feeling never fully left her, even as her diplomatic successes accumulated. She had internalized decades of family messaging that she was not as important as her siblings. And no amount of external validation could fully erase that internal voice. The nights alone in the ambassador's residence, working late on documents and strategies, were lonely in ways that were difficult to articulate. Jean had spent her life being overlooked, and she had developed coping mechanisms for that invisibility. But now that she was finally doing something important, something that truly mattered, she found that the loneliness had not disappeared. It had simply taken a different form. She was no longer invisible because she was unimportant. Now she was invisible because the work she was doing was so quiet, so patient, so unglamorous that even when successful, it generated little public recognition. Jean's ambassadorship ended in 1998, but her groundwork contributed significantly to the Good Friday Agreement signed that same year, the peace accord that largely ended the Troubles and established a framework for power sharing in Northern Ireland. The agreement was imperfect, and implementation would take years, but it represented a genuine transformation from endless violence to political negotiation as the primary means of addressing conflict. When the agreement was signed, the credit went primarily to the politicians and diplomats whose names appeared on the document and who participated in the final dramatic negotiations. Jean Kennedy Smith was mentioned, if at all, as a footnote, the ambassador who had helped facilitate some preliminary groundwork. The substantive nature of her contribution, the years of patient relationship building that had made the final agreement possible, was largely invisible to the public narrative. For Jean, this was both frustrating and somehow fitting. She had spent her entire life being overlooked, and even in her greatest accomplishment, she remained in the shadows. But she also understood that the work itself was what mattered, not the recognition. The Irish peace process had moved forward in ways that had seemed impossible when she first arrived in Dublin. Violence had largely ended. People were talking instead of killing. Children were growing up in Northern Ireland without the constant terror that had defined previous generations. This was Jean's legacy, not headlines or monuments, but actual change in people's lives, accomplished through quiet, patient, unglamorous work that most people never noticed but that mattered profoundly to those affected by it. Jean Kennedy Smith died on June 17, 2020, at age 92, the last surviving sibling of the original 9 Kennedy children. Her obituaries were respectful but brief compared to the endless analysis and mythologizing that had accompanied her brother's deaths. She was noted as the founder of very special arts, as the former U.S. ambassador to Ireland, as the sister who had lived the longest and who had witnessed all the family tragedies without succumbing to them herself. But what the obituaries largely missed was the significance of Jean's life, not in terms of dramatic tragedy or public accomplishment, but in terms of what she represented about different forms of power and different definitions of success. Jean had been dismissed her entire life as the quiet, unimportant Kennedy sister. She had internalized that dismissal, had believed for decades that she truly did not matter compared to her louder, more dramatic siblings. And yet, when given the opportunity, she had accomplished something that none of her brothers had managed. She had contributed meaningfully to ending a conflict that had resisted decades of attempts at resolution. She had done it not through the loud, dramatic exercise of power that her brothers preferred, but through patient, quiet diplomacy that required listening more than speaking, relationship building more than commanding, humility more than ego. Her life revealed something that the Kennedy mythology had always missed, that quiet strength is still strength, that patient work is still meaningful even without headlines, that the overlooked person in the room might actually be the most capable one. Jean had been underestimated her entire life. She had spent decades believing that underestimation was accurate. But when it mattered, when she was finally given a chance to prove herself, she demonstrated capabilities that surprised everyone, including herself. The Camelot myth had no real place for Jean. She did not fit the narrative of tragic martyrdom or dramatic public service. She was simply the sister who lived quietly, worked patiently, and accomplished things that mattered without requiring recognition. In a family defined by loud voices and public drama, Jeanne's quiet competence was almost revolutionary. Not in the sense of overthrowing anything, but in the sense of revealing that there were other ways to matter, other forms of significance beyond the spotlight. What Jean Kennedy Smith's life teaches us is something profound about the nature of power and the limitations of public recognition as a measure of worth. She spent her entire life being told, implicitly and explicitly, that she did not matter as much as her more dramatic siblings. She was the quiet one, the forgettable one, the Kennedy sister who was just there without particularly contributing to the family mythology. But when given responsibility that mattered, when asked to represent the United States in a context where actual diplomatic skill was required, rather than just famous name recognition, Jeanne proved to be remarkably capable. The quiet skills she had developed precisely because she was overlooked. The ability to listen, to build relationships, to work patiently without requiring immediate recognition, turned out to be exactly what was needed for the unglamorous work of facilitating peace negotiations. Her brothers had commanded armies and run for president and been martyred in public squares. Jeanne sat in offices after midnight, negotiating the careful language of peace agreements, and no one will ever write songs about her, but perhaps her contribution was more significant than theirs precisely because it was quieter, more sustainable, more focused on actual change than on public performance. The tragedy of Jeanne's life is not that she was overlooked, though she was. The tragedy is that she believed the dismissal, internalized it so deeply that even when she accomplished something genuinely important, she struggled to recognize her own significance. The Kennedy family had taught her so thoroughly that she did not matter that she could never fully escape that lesson, even when external evidence suggested otherwise. And yet there is also something redemptive in her story. She proved, finally, that the quiet person in the room, the one everyone forgets about, might actually be the most capable one. She demonstrated that patient, unglamorous work can matter more than dramatic public performance. She showed that it is possible to live a meaningful life without headlines, to contribute significantly without recognition, to matter even when the world insists on overlooking you. If you had been Jean Kennedy Smith, if you had spent your entire life being told you did not matter, being overshadowed by louder siblings, being dismissed as the forgettable one, would you have had the courage to accept the ambassadorship? Would you have trusted your own judgment enough to pursue controversial diplomatic strategies when more experienced people told you that you were wrong? Would you have been able to do significant work without needing recognition? Or would you have required the applause that your siblings always demanded? And when we encounter quiet people in our own lives, people who do not demand attention, who work patiently in the background, who contribute without seeking credit, do we recognize their significance? Or do we make the same mistake the Kennedy family made with Jean, assuming that the loudest voice in the room is the most important one? Jean Kennedy Smith negotiated peace in the shadows while the world looked elsewhere. She carried the weight of being Camelot's last diplomatic voice without requiring anyone to acknowledge that weight. She mattered profoundly, even though most people never noticed. What would you have done?